Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take those topics you think you know, and we kind of peel back all the layers.
It's like giving history a really good autopsy.
Exactly. And today, we're diving into Brexit. But not just the headlines, we're talking about the butterfly effect.
Okay, so think about it like this. Those seemingly insignificant moments that, flap by flap, led to the UK's exit from the European Union.
We've got piles of research and analysis here, and believe me when I say this, it gets juicy. Our mission today, we're on a hunt for those butterfly moments in the history of Brexit.
We're talking about those times when someone made a choice, big or small, that sent ripples through time, and we're left wondering, what if?
What if indeed? History is rarely a straight line.
More like a choose-your-own-adventure novel, right?
Yeah.
Every decision a fork in the road leading to a whole new set of possibilities or disasters.
And boy, did Brexit have some twists and turns. So let's rewind the clock all the way back to 1992 and the Maastricht Treaty.
Ah, yes, Maastricht. This is where it all began.
For those of us who might not have been glued to the news back then, give us the lowdown. What was the Maastricht Treaty all about?
Well, in a nutshell, it was the agreement that essentially laid the foundation for the European Union as we know it today.
Okay, so a pretty big deal then.
Huge. But here's what's interesting. From a UK perspective, at least, they negotiated some pretty significant opt-outs.
Opt-outs, meaning they got to say thanks, but no thanks to certain parts of the agreement.
You got it. The big one, the euro.
They didn't adopt the euro back then.
Nope. Decided to stick with the good old pound sterling.
Interesting. So even back then, there were signs of the UK wanting to keep one foot out the door.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? If they'd been fully on board with the euro, embraced deeper integration from the get-go, would we even be talking about Brexit today?
It's like that age-old question. Does a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil really cause a hurricane in Texas? We'll never know for sure.
Exactly. But it does make you think.
It does. But let's not forget, not everyone in the UK was against closer ties with Europe back then.
Oh, absolutely. But at the same time, a new political movement was emerging. A movement that would ultimately become a driving force behind Brexit.
Enter, stage right,
Yeah.
Nigel Farage, and the rise of the UK Independence Party.
UKIP. Catchy name, isn't it?
Oh yeah, UKIP. They weren't exactly shy about their feelings towards the EU, were they?
Not a chance. They were like that friend who always says what everyone else is thinking, but too afraid to say out loud.
And what they were thinking was, let's get out of the EU.
Pretty much. They tapped into a lot of the anxieties that were bubbling beneath the surface. Immigration, sovereignty, you name it.
It's interesting, though, for all their bluster, UKIP never actually gained that much power in Parliament, did they?
True, their electoral success was limited, but their influence, that's a different story.
How so?
They were like a dog nipping at the heels of the bigger parties, especially the Conservatives. They forced the issue of Europe onto the agenda, made it impossible to ignore.
So they were more of an irritant than a real threat.
In a way, yes. But as we know, even a small irritation can sometimes be enough to tip the scales. And in the case of Brexit, that small irritation came in the form of David Cameron's fateful promise, an in-out referendum on EU membership.
Talk about a gamble. 2013, under pressure from UKIP and his own party, Cameron basically said, if we win the next election, we'll let the people decide if they want to stay in the EU or not. I mean, what was he thinking?
Hindsight is 20/20, right? But remember, Cameron was caught between a rock and a hard place. He needed to appease the Eurosceptics in his own party, but he also needed to appeal to the wider electorate.
Trying to keep everyone happy. Never a good strategy.
And in this case, it backfired spectacularly. Because in promising that referendum, Cameron unwittingly unleashed a chain of events that would ultimately lead to his own downfall and the UK's exit from the European Union.
The law of unintended consequences strikes again. Talk about a butterfly effect moment. It's amazing how a single promise made under pressure can have such far-reaching consequences, isn't it?
It's like that old saying, be careful what you wish for.
Because you just might get it. And in Cameron's case, he got it in spades. But let's not forget, all of this is happening against a backdrop of some pretty major global events. Events that, while not directly related to the EU, certainly didn't help matters.
Oh, absolutely. We can't talk about Brexit without talking about the 2008 financial crisis.
Right, because it wasn't just a blip on the radar, was it? The financial crisis shook people to their core.
It was a brutal wake-up call. People lost their homes, their jobs, their sense of security. Suddenly, the future felt very uncertain.
And And when people feel uncertain, they look for someone to blame.
The EU, with its perceived bureaucracy and distance from everyday life, became an easy target for those frustrations.
So even though the financial crisis wasn't about the EU, it created this perfect storm, this breeding ground for Euroscepticism to take root.
It's like that saying, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Cynical, but true. And then, as if things weren't bad enough, just as the UK is starting to recover from the financial crisis, another crisis hits.
The 2015 migration crisis.
The images of refugees fleeing war and persecution were heartbreaking. But it also fueled a lot of anxiety, didn't it?
It did. It tapped into these deep-seated fears about national identity, about cultural change.
Well, let's be honest, the Leave campaign played on those fears, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Take back control became the rallying cry.
And it was brilliant, really.
Yeah.
Because it was so simple, so evocative.
It spoke to something very primal, this desire for security, for certainty in a world that felt increasingly chaotic.
And so the stage is set. You've got economic anxiety, concerns about immigration, and this pervasive feeling of being adrift. And then on June 23, 2016, the unthinkable happens. The UK votes to leave the European Union. Were you surprised by the result?
Honestly, a little bit. I think a lot of people underestimated the depth of feeling, the desire for change.
And I don't think anyone, not even the most ardent Leave supporter, could have predicted the sheer chaos that would follow.
It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. The pound plummeted, the prime minister resigned, and the UK was plunged into a political crisis, the likes of which we hadn't seen in decades.
Talk about a political hangover. It's like the morning after a wild party where you made a huge decision, and now you have to face the consequences. Except in this case, the consequences weren't just a headache and a dry mouth. They were playing out on a global scale.
The stakes were incredibly high, and someone had to step in and try to clean up this mess. Enter Theresa May.
Theresa May, the UK's Iron Lady 2.0.
Well, she certainly had her work cut out for her. She inherited a political minefield, her task, to negotiate a withdrawal agreement with the EU that would satisfy both those who voted to leave and those who voted to remain.
Which, let's be honest, was like trying to herd cats.
To say it was a challenging task would be a massive understatement.
And to make matters worse, the Leave campaign didn't exactly have a detailed plan for what would happen after the vote, did they?
It was all a bit, we'll figure it out later, wasn't it?
Which, in hindsight, might not have been the best approach. But anyway, back to Theresa May. She's got this impossible task ahead of her. What's her next move?
Well, she tries to walk that tightrope, that very fine line between what the UK wants and what the EU is willing to give.
And does she succeed?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and more than a little messy.
We're back to the UK's very own soap opera, Brexit. Where were we? Oh, right, on the edge of a cliffhanger. No deal, a ticking clock. Did Theresa May manage to pull a rabbit out of her hat?
Well, about that rabbit, more like a whole different magician showed up.
Don't tell me, Boris Johnson.
The one and only. With May's deal down for the count, Johnson swoops in, paints himself as the savior of Brexit.
Hold on, the same Boris Johnson who campaigned for Leave, who everyone thought was all talk, no action.
That's the one. He sees an opening, right?
Yeah.
May's deal is dead, everyone's panicking about no deal, and he's like, hold my pint, I got this.
So what do you do differently?
Remember that whole Northern Ireland backstop thing? The insurance policy to avoid a hard border?
Yeah, it seemed to trip everyone up.
Johnson used that. He'd been railing against it for ages, said it chained the UK to the EU. So he goes back to the EU, let's make a deal, or I walk.
Bold move. Did it work? Did the EU cave?
Let's just say everyone was tired of this Brexit saga. The EU wants it over, but they've got their own interests to protect. It was a standoff, like two gunslingers in the street.
Who blinked first?
Johnson's squeezed out a revised deal, not massively different from May's, but some tweaks to the Irish border thing, enough to keep his own party happy.
So, after all that drama, January 31st, 2020, the UK officially leaves the EU. Everyone pops the champagne, right?
If only. That was just the end of the beginning.
So like a bad breakup, saying it's over is easy, dividing the stuff.
Yeah.
Nightmare.
Exactly. Except instead of furniture, it's trade deals, regulations, all this stuff tangled up over decades.
So more chaos.
They avoided no deal, eventually got a trade agreement, but remember all that frictionless trade the Leave campaign promised? Turns out, not so simple.
Surprise, surprise. What went wrong this time?
Unraveling decades of being intertwined. Messy. New barriers popped up, smaller businesses especially felt it.
So less taking back control, more what do we do now?
Pretty much. And don't forget the Irish border. Johnson's deal didn't magically solve that.
Right, that pesky border. What happened there?
They came up with this Northern Ireland Protocol. Avoids a physical border, but
creates an invisible one.
Exactly. More tension, both sides saying the other's not playing fair. Brexit just kept on giving in all the wrong ways.
The gift that keeps on taking, really. So, where are we now, years later? Has the dust settled?
Too soon to say. Economically, politically, the UK's still figuring things out.
The saga continues.
What's fascinating, though, is what Brexit tells us about more than just the UK. That pull towards going it alone, even in a world with these huge interconnected problems, it's a trend.
Makes you wonder, is that the real legacy of Brexit? Not just what happened to the UK, but what it says about all of us.
And that, my friend, is the butterfly effect in action. One little flap decades ago, and here we are.
Makes you think, what seemingly small choices are we making today that'll seem huge years from now?
The answer to that is a whole other deep dive. But for now, keep those butterfly wings in mind. Even the smallest actions can have massive consequences.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for today's Deep Dive. But don't worry, we'll be back next week to untangle another knot in the fabric of history. Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.